So with that, I think that brings me to our last speaker, Professor Andrew Geddes from the European University Institute. Andrew, tell us what we can do differently from a European perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Great, thanks. Many thanks to the organisers for inviting me to contribute. And many thanks to the participants for sticking it out for an hour and a half to get to me. I'll try and be to the point. What I want to do is talk about the governance of migration in Europe, because I think that regional governance in Europe has some interesting lessons for global governance. I'm going to just talk very quickly about four things. One about crisis, one about policy, one about politics, and a point about the future. So that's what I'm going to just organise this brief intervention around these 4 points, which all link to the theme of governance. So I've only got a few minutes. I can't really go into well, so many issues we could go into, but I'm just going to focus particularly on governance. And I'm particularly interested in that because I think the arrangements, governance arrangements, institutions, laws, policies, and the ideas that inform them have huge implications for migration and mobility. So governance is really important. It's not just a reaction to migration, it shapes that migration. I think we need to understand governance, as this webinar has done, as being very crucial. So first point, crisis, was just mentioned by Shabari just now in terms of the relations between the EU and Africa. What I would say is that the crisis of 2015, however understood, and I think in particular it was became a political crisis in Europe, was a driver of global developments. But if we look in Europe, there was a financial crisis after 2008, which was also a global financial crisis. There was obviously what was called the migration crisis after 2015. But I would argue that neither led to significant institutional policy changes. I think the direction of travel of EU migration and asylum policy was established in the early 1990s. So I don't expect the COVID-19 crisis to lead to a fundamental change in EU and European migration and asylum policies. Previous crises haven't, and I'd be surprised if this one did, because I think the choices have been made and are quite deeply embedded. Second, in relation to policy. So if we look at policy in the European Union, I think there's a big contrast between what would be called internal and external dimensions of policy. Internal is essentially the free movement and mobility provisions that are a kind of founding principle of the European Union dating back to the 1950s and realised through the 1960s and subsequently with important legal developments which provide rights of free movement for EU citizens. More recent on the scene, there's been measures applied to non-EU citizens, and in particular, I think what's developed since the 1990s is what will be called an external dimension of migration and asylum policy, and that's particularly relevant in relation to what Charles was just talking about from the IGAD perspective and also from African Union perspective, the implications of the external dimension of EU migration policy for non-member states. And I think the big issue here, the relationship between internal and external policy in the European Union is mediated by the idea of solidarity between EU member states. An absence of solidarity or an effective absence of solidarity between EU member states has, I think, led to a greater emphasis on offloading or externalizing migration policy to non-member states. And so that's a kind of point about policy. My third point is about politics, and I think this is really crucial in the European Union, the kind of politics of migration. Immigration has been politicized in the European Union. By politicized, I mean it has been salient, so it's been an important topic of public debate, and it's also been, the debate has also been polarized between opponents of immigration and those who are more supportive of immigration. So that level of politicization, I think, has been an important dynamic in Europe. I would emphasize that that does not mean, I would emphasize this very strongly, that attitudes to migration in Europe have not become more negative. We do a lot of work on that here at the European University Institute. Over the last 20 years, attitudes to migration, to immigration from within and from outside the European Union have become more favorable in Europe. not more negative. It's a complete misunderstanding to imagine there's an increase in anti-immigration sentiment in Europe. What there has been is increased attention to the issue and increased salience of the issue in public debate, not a change in attitudes in a more opposed way to immigration. What I think is important is there's a new dividing line in European politics. And that dividing line often centres around the understandings of the effects of globalisation. People who are more favourable to globalisation, people who are more opposed to globalisation. And immigration and European integration have become associated with this important new dividing line in European politics, which is about the meaning and the effects of globalisation. It's become quite contentious in European politics. I think that's a point about the politics of this in Europe, which is perhaps different from other regions because of the way that the EU is institutionalized by treaty with lawmaking powers and its own institutions. It's become much more of a contentious issue in European politics because of its presence as a political system in its own right, with its own lawmaking powers, and those who are favourable to it and those who are opposed to it has created a new dividing line in European politics. And a final point is about, well, the future. What does all this mean? And I think if we want to think about, well, we can't predict the future, but what we can do is think about what the recent past might tell us about the future. And we can also see some imminent developments in the EU that might give us some signals. Now, an imminent development in Europe is a new compact on migration, which the European Commission is currently developing. And I think that is going to make further efforts to develop a common European response. Now, the response in Europe to this compact proposed by the Commission will be very important because I think it will show to us either the opportunities for deeper regional integration or the limits to deeper regional integration. I think it's a key moment. It's not whether the EU itself will rise or fall. I think that would be exaggerating. But I think that we would see the potential limits of regionalism if the compact is unable to secure the support of member states, if they do not see a sufficient level of solidarity, or if we don't see a sufficient level of solidarity to support a greater role for the European Union in the area of migration and asylum policy. And as a very final point, I would argue that if we see limits to the regionalism, or limits to regionalism, then we will see limits to globalization, because I would argue that any attainment of global objectives depends fundamentally upon regions and the incorporation of global standards into regional norms, standards and practices. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. You know, I've actually learned something, and I will take this away because I hear and see your commitment to what you're saying and your conviction almost on this point that attitudes to immigration in Europe have not become more negative. Good, and I think then that leads us to perhaps also then rethink this discourse along those lines. If it has not become more negative, then and if it is about the politics within Europe, then how exactly do we change these issues? You know, I've heard a lot of leaders in the Gulf states say, we don't understand why Europe keeps talking to us about human rights when the conversations in Europe are also about only high-skilled migrants, while in the Gulf we give options for everybody, you know, whether you're high or low-skilled or professional or whatnot. And I think it's important for us to then reconcile these different views and values that we see coming from the different regional perspectives. But thanks so much for that, Andrew, and really taking us forward. I remember during the Global Compact for Migration negotiations, it was a tough discussion, particularly from within the European Union context itself. And of course, now with Brexit,